The chandeliers of Thornfield Hall blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames throwing trembling pools of gold onto the long mahogany dining table. Footmen in powdered wigs moved like silent ships in a sea of silk and jewels, decanting claret with practiced precision. The Duke of Rookwood, Alexander Montclair, surveyed the assembled guests with the same rigorous calculation he applied to his shipping ledgers and parliamentary speeches. He was a man who appreciated order, and the seating arrangement at his aunt's annual house party was a matter of strategic importance. He found his place card with ease, the embossed Duke of Rookwood sitting at the right hand of his aunt's empty chair, a position of honor. Satisfied, he allowed his gaze to drift to the card to his immediate right. The name, written in Lady Henrietta's elegant but forceful hand, was not one he expected. Miss Margaret Ashby. The satisfaction curdled into sharp displeasure. He knew of her, a paid companion to Mrs. Fenchurch, his aunt's aging and near-deaf school friend. The woman was essentially a shadow, a piece of background furniture in the homes of the wealthy. To place her beside the highest-ranking gentleman at the table was a breach of protocol so profound it bordered on deliberate mockery. His jaw tightened as he assumed it was a foolish oversight by a nearsighted steward. He watched her approach the table. She was not a woman who commanded a room. She seemed to move through it without disturbing the air. Her gown was a simple dove gray, the cut modest and unadorned, her hair dressed without the elaborate plumes and jewels that adorned the other ladies. Yet when she found her seat, there was no fumbling confusion. She saw the placement, a fleeting surprise in her calm, hazel eyes, and then she sat with the quiet grace of a falling leaf. She did not look at him. "A mistake," Alexander murmured, more to himself than to her, as he settled into his chair. Miss Ashby turned her head a fraction. "His Grace will find Lady Henrietta makes very few of those." Her voice was low and even, a cello note amidst the shrill violins of the other women's chatter. He stared at her profile, the clean line of her nose, the resolute set of her chin. Before he could formulate a suitably quelling reply, his aunt swept in, a vision in purple satin and a turban with a preposterous ostrich feather. Lady Henrietta was a widow of immense wealth and even greater will. "Alexander, you look as though your soup has been seasoned with vinegar. Miss Ashby, I trust you find the room agreeable. The light is kinder by this end." Her sharp eyes missed nothing, twinkling with an intelligence that had outmaneuvered 3 prime ministers in its time. "My lady, the room is exceptional," Margaret replied. The first course was served, a delicate turtle soup. Alexander ate in a fortress of silence, acutely aware of the woman beside him. She did not prattle. She did not ply him with desperate, meaningless questions. Her cutlery moved with unhurried precision. The silence became a third presence at the table, a palpable entity that he found he could not dominate. "You enjoy your work with Mrs. Fenchurch?" he finally asked, the question intended as a condescending reminder of her station. Margaret laid down her spoon. "I find purpose in ensuring her comfort. She possesses a lifetime of stories that few take the time to hear. It is a privilege to be the one who does." The answer was unnervingly direct. No simpering, no self-pity. It reframed her subordinate position as one of profound value. He was, for a terrifying second, the man who had failed to see the worth in a quiet act of service. The hook was in. He spent the remainder of the meal attempting to dismantle her composure with acerbic observations about the countryside, but her replies were a fortress of polite, intelligent indifference. She was unassailable. As the ladies rose to withdraw, leaving the gentlemen to their port, Lady Henrietta caught his eye from the head of the table. She did not wink, nor did she smile. She simply held his gaze with a look of magnificent, unrepentant triumph. It was no oversight. His aunt, a woman who deployed seating charts like a general deployed cavalry, had placed the wrong woman beside him on purpose, and the realization that he did not fully understand her objective was the most unsettling sensation Alexander Montclair had experienced in years. The second dinner came with a grim predictability. Alexander approached the table with the purposeful stride of a man walking to a duel, already knowing the weapon that would be used against him. There it was again. Miss Margaret Ashby. The card seemed to glow against the damask, a quiet declaration of war from his aunt. He was not merely seated beside a companion, he was being subjected to a lesson, and the tutelage grated against every fiber of his ducal pride. Tonight she wore a gown of a deep, mossy green. It was still simple, but the color shifted her eyes to something deeper, the hue of a forest floor. He gave a curt nod and sat, resolving to dismantle her with a strategic application of oppressive silence. Let her flounder in the void of his disinterest. For the soup course he said nothing. For the fish he addressed a remark exclusively to the Countess on his left, a woman whose conversational topics were confined to her pug's digestion. Miss Ashby remained a serene presence, consuming her soul with unbothered precision. His tactic was failing. Her silence was not a vacuum of humiliation. It was a comfortable, self-contained stillness. She had no need for his words. It was Sir Gerald Finch, seated further down the table, who broke Alexander's unspoken siege. Sir Gerald was a baronet of modest fortune and immodest charm, a man whose laugh was a rich, honeyed baritone that drew feminine smiles like a magnet. "Miss Ashby," Sir Gerald's voice carried up the table, "I have just been telling Lady Merton that your knowledge of the local wildflowers is prodigious. You identified that bluestem grass with an accuracy that put my bailiff to shame during our walk today." Margaret turned, and a genuine, unguarded smile touched her lips. It was a smile she had not once offered the Duke. "Sir Gerald is too kind. I merely pay attention." "A lost art, one would say, and far more valuable than a library one never reads," Sir Gerald declared, his gaze lingering on her with open admiration. A sharp, unidentifiable feeling lanced through Alexander's chest. It was irritation, he told himself. Irritation at the boorishness of open flattery across a dinner table at the interruption of his strategy. He leaned fractionally toward Margaret. "You condone such blunt praise, Miss Ashby. In my experience, it is a tool used by men who lack substance." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, her gaze a steady and unnervingly calm sea. "Sir Gerald's praise was for a skill, your grace. It is a different kind of compliment, one rooted in observation, not empty flattery. I find the distinction refreshing." The words were a velvet-trapped stiletto. She had just implied with devastating politeness that he, a duke, would not know the difference. He saw Sir Gerald raise a glass in her direction with a warm smile, and the irritation in Alexander's chest sharpened into something that felt alarmingly like a proprietary anger. It was an absurd, primitive reaction. He had no claim. He wanted no claim. As the dessert plates were cleared, he found his voice again, lower, more dangerous. "Be wary of a man's observation, Miss Ashby. It often masks an entirely different ambition." Margaret placed her napkin on the table, her expression unruffled. "Then a woman must trust her own observation to discern it, your grace. Good evening." She rose with the other ladies, leaving him with the claret and the maddening, lingering scent of not perfume, but clean linen and something herbal, like dried rosemary from a garden. He watched her leave, her green gown disappearing into the corridor, and realized he had not managed a single topic of his own choosing. She had led the conversation as surely as she led a frail old woman through a garden. The lesson he was supposed to be giving was the one he was receiving, and the tutor was quietly, inexorably, winning. The thought was not entirely unpleasant, and that was the most unsettling part of all. The afternoon sun gilded the formal gardens of Thornfield Hall, drawing the scent of boxwood and rose into the warm air. Alexander walked the gravel path with no destination, his thoughts a disorganized clutter he could not attribute to any single source. He paused by the balustrade overlooking the sunken garden, and his attention was caught by a figure in a dove-gray dress. Margaret Ashby was kneeling on the path, heedless of her gown. Before her stood a young maid, tears streaking her face, a shattered terracotta pot at her feet. The girl was in hysterics, clutching a bruised geranium. Alexander expected Miss Ashby to summon a footman to handle the mess with detached instruction. Instead, she reached out and took the maid's muddy hands in her own. "It is not ruined," Margaret said, her voice a soft, steady balm. "See, the root ball is whole. We will find a new pot from the orangery and no one will be the wiser. The shock of the fall will make it bloom even brighter. The geranium is a stubborn, resilient thing. A lesson to us all, would you not agree?" The maid sniffled, a watery smile breaking through her distress. Margaret smiled back, a look of genuine, unadorned kindness, and began to help her gather the soil. There was no performance here, no awareness of an audience. Alexander felt a sudden, piercing shame, as if he were a trespasser on sacred ground. His entire world was built on hierarchies, on a clear and enforced distance between the lower and the higher. Yet here, dignity was not a rank to be bestowed, but a currency that this almost penniless companion spent freely, making him feel bankrupt. He retreated before he could be seen, but the image of her mudded hands, the quiet authority of her compassion, was branded onto his mind. Minutes later, from the terrace, he saw Sir Gerald approaching her down the lime walk, his posture full of cheerful intent. A predatory instinct, swift and unthinking, surged through Alexander. He strode down the steps and intercepted them just as Sir Gerald offered his arm. "Miss Ashby," Alexander said, his voice clipped and forceful, "my aunt is asking for you in the library, a matter regarding Mrs. Fenchurch's evening comfort." It was a blatant falsehood. Margaret knew it. The flicker in her eyes, part confusion, part challenge, told him she knew it. Sir Gerald looked annoyed but could not countermand a duke's assertion. With an apologetic bow to Margaret, the baronet retreated. "Your aunt made no such request," Margaret stated when they were out of earshot, standing in the cool shadow of the stone terrace. Her tone was not accusatory, but calmly factual. "A necessary fiction," Alexander said, his heart a thunderclap against his ribs. He stood too close to her, the space between them charged with the thing he refused to name. "What are your intentions with Sir Gerald?" Her expression did not change. "My intentions." "Do not play the innocent. A man of his modest station makes his interest plain. Are you encouraging him?" The question, so clumsy, so possessive, hung in the air. She did not retreat from his imposing physical presence. She merely tilted her head, her hazel eyes holding his with an unnerving clarity. "Your Grace, you have mistaken your role. My intentions concerning any man are not a matter for your interrogation. You have the authority of a duke, but that authority stops at the boundary of my conscience. You have no right to demand an answer." No right. The words were a physical blow precisely aimed. She stripped away his title, his land, his power, and saw him as a man overstepping his bounds. His arrogance had been the shield. She had simply walked around it. He was left speechless, his mouth a hard, dry line. She did not wait for a reply that he was incapable of forming. She gave a brief civil nod that dismissed him more effectively than a slammed door and walked away, her shoulders straight. The quiet, unseen piece of background furniture now the commanding center of the entire landscape. He was left holding nothing but the sharp fragments of his own shattered pride. And for the first time in his adult life, Alexander Montclair felt utterly, profoundly in the wrong. The letter arrived with the morning post, though it had not been mailed. It simply appeared on the silver salver in the great hall, a single sheet of cheap paper folded without a seal, and by noon its poison had seeped into every corner of Thornfield Hall. The words were not shouted but murmured behind fans, passed from gloved hand to gloved hand with the delighted horror of those who feast on ruin. The companion is a fortune hunter of the most calculated sort. Observe how she insinuates herself beside the Duke. Her poverty is a weapon, her modesty a mask. She seeks a title to fill her empty purse. Margaret Ashby read the words in the dim light of the upstairs corridor, where a smirking lady's maid had pressed the page into her hand as if bestowing a gift. The paper did not tremble. Her fingers remained steady. She folded it once, twice, and tucked it into the sleeve of her gown, the motion as deliberate as a soldier sheathing a blade. She would not burn it. She would not weep. She would descend to dinner as she did every evening, and she would give the gossips nothing to feast upon but their own starvation. The dining room that night was a battlefield draped in lace. Eyes darted to Margaret the moment she entered, 100 tiny arrows of curiosity and judgment. Her gown was the same dove gray she had worn the first night, a statement of unapologetic consistency. She walked to her seat beside the Duke, the place that had become a scandal's centerpiece, and sat with the quiet composure of a queen ascending a throne the crowd had not yet recognized. Alexander had read the letter. He had crushed his copy in his fist, the paper a brittle corpse in his pocket. He watched her now, this woman who refused to bleed in public. The Countess on his left tittered something about ambitious creatures, and he silenced her with a glance that could freeze brandy in its decanter. The soup was served. The whispers hummed beneath the clink of spoons like wasps trapped against glass. Margaret lifted her spoon, her hand steady, her face a mask of serene indifference that Alexander now understood was not indifference at all. It was armor, forged in the quiet fires of a life spent overlooked. He made a decision. It arrived not as a thought but as an imperative, a thing his body understood before his mind could object. He set down his spoon with a decisive click and turned in his chair to face her directly, a gesture that drew every eye in the room. "Miss Ashby," he said, his voice carrying with the practiced resonance of a man who had addressed the House of Lords, "I have been considering the matter we discussed regarding tenant reform on my northern estates. You mentioned the rotational grazing practiced by the Cumberland farmers. I would value your further thoughts on its application to fallow field recovery." The room shifted. The wasps fell silent. A duke did not ask a paid companion for agricultural counsel unless he respected her mind. The question was a public declaration of intellectual regard, and it reframed every whispered accusation as petty slander. Margaret met his gaze, and in the depths of her hazel eyes he saw a flicker of something that was not gratitude. It was recognition. She understood what he had done, and she accepted the shield not as a rescue but as a strategic alliance. "The principle requires patience, Your Grace," she replied, her voice as clear as a struck bell. "The soil must rest before it can yield again. One cannot force a harvest from exhausted ground." The metaphor was not lost on him. She was speaking of fields, but her eyes told him she was speaking of redemption. He nodded, and for the rest of the meal they discussed crop rotation and drainage systems with the intensity of generals planning a campaign. The gossips withered, their poison neutralized by the antidote of the Duke's unmistakable approval. Margaret Ashby, the quiet shadow, had been illuminated by the one man whose opinion could silence a room. She had not needed saving, but she had allowed him to stand beside her, and that gesture of permission was the most profound gift anyone had ever offered him. Alexander found the letter's author 2 days later. Lady Henrietta's quiet investigation, conducted with the efficiency of a spymaster, traced the handwriting to a widow named Mrs. Diana Haverford, a woman whose late husband had left her a title but little fortune. She had set her sights on the Duke of Rookwood, and the presence of a quiet companion who commanded his attention had been an insult her vanity could not tolerate. He confronted her in the music room, the door closed, his voice a cold and terrible instrument. He did not shout. He simply informed her that her carriage would be ready at dawn, that her absence from any future gathering he attended was a condition of his continued silence, and that if she ever spoke Margaret Ashby's name again, he would ensure every creditor she owed knew the precise location of her London residence. She left in tears. He felt nothing but a hollow disgust. When he returned to the main house, intending to inform Margaret that the threat was eliminated, he found the upstairs corridor alive with quiet commotion. A lady's maid hurried past carrying a valise. Mrs. Fenchurch's door stood open, and the old woman's querulous voice drifted out, asking why dear Margaret was packing. The word struck Alexander with the force of a physical blow. Packing. He found her in the library, a room of leather and dust and filtered sunlight. She stood by the tall window, her profile outlined against the glass, her hands clasped before her. There was no trunk, no evidence of departure, but the stillness of her posture was the stillness of someone who had already said goodbye. "You are leaving," he said. It was not a question. She turned. Her expression was calm, but beneath it lay a weariness that spoke of old battles, of a lifetime spent protecting others from the shrapnel of her proximity. "Mrs. Fenchurch has been distressed by the talk. She does not understand it, but she feels its edges. I will escort her home and then seek a new position. It is the proper course." "The letter was the work of a jealous woman," Alexander said, stepping further into the room. "She has been dealt with. There is no reason for you to go." "There is every reason." Margaret's voice remained steady, but he heard the fracture beneath it. "I am a companion, Your Grace. My value depends on my invisibility. The moment I become visible, the moment my name passes through drawing rooms as a subject of speculation, I am a liability. Not to myself. I have long ceased to care for my own reputation, but to the woman who depends on me. I will not let my presence cause her discomfort." The logic was brutal and irrefutable. She was sacrificing herself not out of fear, but out of a fierce, unyielding loyalty to a deaf old woman who told her stories. The nobility of it undid something deep inside Alexander's chest. "Stay." The word left him before he could measure it, before the Duke could remind the man that he was exposing himself in a way that invited devastation. It was not a command. It was a plea, raw and unvarnished. Margaret studied him, her head tilting with that quiet, unnerving perception. "Why does it matter to you, Your Grace?" The question demanded an honesty he had never offered another human being. He could not say love. He was not certain he knew what love felt like. He could not say need, for a duke did not need a companion. He reached for the only truth he could grasp. "The thought of this house without your presence," he said, his voice roughened by the effort of confession, "is suddenly unbearable." Silence stretched between them, filled with the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. Margaret did not soften. She did not weep or smile or yield. She simply nodded, a slow, considered movement that acknowledged his words without accepting them as absolution. "I will stay," she said, "for Mrs. Fenchurch, and because I do not believe in allowing malicious letters to dictate my movements." She paused, and her next words were the gentlest blade he had ever received. "But do not mistake my remaining for something it is not, Your Grace. The distance you placed between us at the beginning of this party was your choice. I have merely learned to live within it." She left the library, and the door closed behind her with a soft, irrevocable click. Alexander stood in the silence. The unbearable thing she had named now a weight he would carry alone. The final ball of the house party arrived draped in moonlight and music. Thornfield Hall's ballroom glittered with the splendor of 100 candles, their flames reflected in the polished floor like captured stars. The guests, freed from the tensions of the preceding days, danced with the manic gaiety of those who had survived a siege. But Alexander Montclair did not dance. He stood at the edge of the room, a sentinel carved from shadow, and watched. Margaret Ashby wore a gown of pale amber silk that Lady Henrietta had mysteriously insisted upon lending her. It transformed her from a quiet companion into a woman of quiet radiance, the color warming her skin to the hue of honey in sunlight. She danced a country reel with Sir Gerald Finch, her steps light, her laughter, when it came, a sound that reached across the ballroom and wrapped around Alexander's heart like wire. When the reel ended, Sir Gerald did not release her hand. He leaned close, spoke words Alexander could not hear, and then led her toward the French doors that opened onto the moonlit terrace. Alexander watched them go, his feet rooted to the floor, his mind screaming at him to move. He moved. He circled the ballroom's perimeter, avoiding conversation, avoiding his aunt's knowing gaze, until he reached the same doors. He stepped onto the terrace and stopped in the shadow of a stone pillar. Below, in the garden, the scene was illuminated by a moon so bright it seemed to have bleached the color from the world. Sir Gerald Finch knelt on one knee on the gravel path, Margaret's hands in his face upturned with earnest, hopeful adoration. The proposal was unmistakable, its words a murmur that carried on the night air like the scent of night-blooming jasmine. Sir Gerald offered her his name, his modest estate, a life free from the servitude of companionship. He offered her security. He offered her escape. Alexander's blood turned to ice in his veins. This was the moment. This was the culmination of every opportunity he had squandered with his arrogance, every conversation he had dominated with condescension, every silence he had weaponized. He saw with the terrible clarity of irrevocable loss that he loved her. Not the idea of her, not the challenge of her, but the woman herself, her quiet strength, her unyielding dignity, her refusal to be diminished. And he had done nothing to earn her. Nothing. He turned away, unable to watch the acceptance, unable to witness the smile she would bestow upon a man who had recognized her worth without needing a scandal and a near ruin to force his eyes open. He retreated into the ballroom, the music a grotesque mockery, the laughter of the guests a discordant noise against the silence of his own desolation. He did not see Margaret gently raise Sir Gerald to his feet. He did not hear her soft refusal, her words of genuine gratitude and genuine regret. He did not see her explain, with a wisdom that broke her own heart, that security was not the same as love, and that her heart, stubborn, inconvenient thing, had fixed itself elsewhere, on a man who might never be capable of meeting it. He only saw her re-enter the ballroom. She paused at the threshold, her amber gown catching the candlelight, and her eyes searched the room. They found him. Across the glittering expanse of dancers and music and silk, their gazes locked. What she saw in his face made her own expression shift, a softening, a question, a grief that mirrored his own. He looked at her not as a duke assessing a companion, but as a man staring at the woman he had lost before he had ever possessed her. The distance between them had never been greater, and yet, in that shared look of aching, unspoken loss, they had never been closer. The morning after the ball, Lady Henrietta summoned Alexander to the conservatory. The invitation arrived on her personal stationery, the handwriting as imperious as the woman herself, and it brooked no refusal. He went with the heavy tread of a man marching toward his own reckoning. The conservatory was a cathedral of glass and green, filled with ferns that unfurled like ancient secrets and orchids that hung from their baskets like captive moons. The air smelled of damp earth and the sweet, cloying perfume of jasmine. Lady Henrietta sat on a wrought-iron bench, her purple turban replaced by a simpler lace cap, her sharp eyes undimmed. Beside her, rising as he entered, stood Margaret Ashby. She wore her own dove-gray gown this time, the amber silk returned to its owner. She was herself again, the quiet companion, and yet Alexander saw her now with new eyes. He saw the spine of steel beneath the modest fabric, the intelligence burning steady behind the calm hazel gaze. "Sit," Lady Henrietta commanded, gesturing to a chair opposite them. "Both of you. I have endured 4 weeks of watching two intelligent people circle each other like wary cats, and my patience is exhausted." Alexander sat. Margaret remained standing. Lady Henrietta sighed. "Very well, the girl will stand. Margaret, my dear, I have known you since you were a child trailing after your father in his vicarage. I know what you are made of. Alexander, I have known you since you were a squalling infant with an unearned sense of entitlement. I know what you are capable of becoming." She fixed her nephew with a glare that had felled prime ministers. "Speak, not to me, to her, and for the love of heaven, do not give me the speech you give Parliament." Lady Henrietta rose and walked to the far end of the conservatory, busying herself with an orchid as if it held the secrets of the universe. The silence she left behind was vast and terrifying. Alexander rose from his chair. He faced Margaret, and the words he had rehearsed in the sleepless hours of the night, the grand declarations, the poetic confessions, dissolved like mist in the morning sun. They were not true. They were performance. She had earned nothing less than the unvarnished, ungraceful truth. "I have no right to speak to you," he began, his voice low and rough. "I forfeited any claim to your regard the moment I looked at you and saw only what you lacked instead of what you are. I have been arrogant. I have been blind. I have wielded my title like a shield against the vulnerability of genuine feeling." Margaret did not speak. Her face was unreadable, but she did not look away. "I watched Sir Gerald kneel before you last night," he continued, "and I understood with a clarity that left no room for pride that I had lost something I had never possessed. Not your affection. I have done nothing to earn that, but the possibility of it. The chance to know you as a man knows a woman, without the armor of rank, without the distance of station." He paused. The next words were the hardest, because they required him to offer something without any guarantee of acceptance. "I am not asking for your forgiveness. That is a gift you may choose to bestow or withhold, and I will accept either. I am asking for the opportunity to begin again, not as a duke to a companion, as Alexander to Margaret, a courtship built on honesty, on the quiet dignity you have always demanded and I have so often failed to offer. I am asking for nothing more than a chance to prove that the man you saw beneath the arrogance is a man worthy of your time." The silence that followed was the longest of his life. The conservatory's glass walls held the morning light, and in its gentle illumination he saw the minute shifts in Margaret's expression, the slight furrow of her brow, the softening around her mouth, the sheen that brightened her eyes. "You speak of honesty," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to crack it. "Then hear mine. I did not refuse Sir Gerald because I expected a better offer. I refused him because my heart had already chosen, against all wisdom, against all self-preservation. It chose a man who made me feel unseen, and then slowly made me feel like the only person in the room." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, the faint lines of strain and resilience etched around them. "I will not grant you a victory, your grace. I have spent my life being grateful for scraps, but I will grant you a beginning, a true one built on the honesty you have finally offered. The rest you must earn." She extended her hand, not for a kiss, not yet, but for the clasp of an equal, the handshake of a partnership not yet formed but now, for the first time, genuinely possible. Alexander took it. Her fingers were warm and firm, and the contact was more intimate than any embrace he had ever known. From the far end of the conservatory, Lady Henrietta made a sound that was suspiciously like a sniffle. "About time," she muttered to her orchid. "I was beginning to think I would have to seat them together at my funeral." The remark shattered the tension. A laugh, startled and genuine, escaped Margaret's lips. Alexander smiled, a true smile, unguarded and boyish and entirely unbefitting a duke, and in the glass-walled cathedral of green and light, the future unfurled like a fern, slow and ancient and full of quiet, enduring hope.